I'm going to teach you all about 4 types of practice, times 4 we're going to cover here. And the first one I want to address with you is what we refer to as massed practice. Now, I chose the image here of a seated volleyball player because I thought it was kind of the sort of thing where you could basically, with the right sort of feed of the ball, you could practice the shot again and again and again and again. And in essence, folks, that's what we're talking about with mass practice. We are talking about ongoing trials, not of the legal type, but of practicing a skill. And we do trial followed by trial followed by trial followed by trial followed by trial. Now, obviously, we're going to say in a second that there are no breaks in between trials. In fact, let me say that now. I just did, and indeed I'm writing it down. No breaks between trials. But of course, there is sort of a naturally occurring break because, it's a discrete skill and you've got to have another ball fed into you and that sort of thing. But what we're saying is there's no structured breaks. You can see here, trial, 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 trial. And this would just carry on, right? Trial, trial, until the session or that practice element was considered to be finished. Now, why would we do this in a practice type scenario? Well, perhaps the most important and most fundamental point is it maximizes practice time. So think about your practice time simply as an equation. If you've got, let's say, a 10-minute episode, this is going to get the maximum number of trials into that episode. That's what's going to be achieved. Now, there's obviously other things that are lost from that. We'll come back to that point in a few moments' time. I think I've just got to scoot down here a touch. Now, second point is this is really good for discrete skills. It's also really good for closed skills, and we're going to come back to that notion in a second. And it's also really positive for self-paced skills. So obviously what I'm writing in green here, folks, is positives. These are the positives of the evaluative structure. So if it's a discrete skill, in this case a set in a volleyball, that can be practiced and then repeated. We effectively end one trial, start the next, end one trial, start the next, and so on. So it works really well in those environments. Now, we say it's good for closed skills. It doesn't have to be a closed skill, but of course, more open skills require a more sort of adaptable, sort of broader schema. So generally speaking, this will be done more with closed skills. This is a point that I would really get you to think about. It's excellent for applying the notions of operant conditioning. Now, I don't know at this point whether you have or haven't studied operant conditioning and the other learning theories, but one of the key processes with operant conditioning is what we call trial and error. Okay, you repeat something over and over again, and through the process of practicing it and reinforcement, there's a trial and error process that goes on that can help refine and sort of strengthen a bond between a certain sporting stimulus and a certain sporting response. If you've studied that already, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If you haven't, that's coming up. Another thing about mass practice, it's excellent for the overlearning, so I'm going to say overlearn essential skills. Now, you might look at the term overlearn and think, well, what is James talking about there? Overlearn is a really, really lovely subject term for you to use. It's about honing and grooving something which is essential to performance, in this case, a set shot. And it also leads to fitness development. Now, you can imagine that if this seated volleyball player here is doing this over and over again, it will strengthen, for example, their core muscles. It will strengthen their neck muscles. It might strengthen their shoulders, and so on. But there are negatives, and I'm putting those in red. There is no feedback. Now, if we consider, well, I would say certainly no extrinsic feedback, but if we would consider the sort of the point of no feedback equals no learning, that's a bit of a problem, right? Feedback is the fundamental, I guess, currency of learning. So that's a really important one. Other ones, it's really physically challenging. Now, of course, that leads to fitness development. But if, for example, you've looked at Thorndike's laws, we must apply, for example, the law of readiness. Are the participants physically and emotionally mature enough? Now, that's a good question. It's no good for high intensity. So no good for high intensity. So if this was, for example, really doing powerful smashes in badminton, the person's obviously going to fatigue, right? They're going to get tired. And the other negative here is it requires, and I'm going to put up arrow, lots of motivation. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing in life in general, but of course, if we're working with inexperienced performers, non-motivated performers, young performers, that might be a problem. Now, let's take it further. We don't just want to look at our mass practice. We also want to look at this example here, which is called distributed practice. Now, I've chosen, I guess, what we'd loosely call somersault here on a beam routine, and I want you to be aware of distributed practice because its main characteristic is the inclusion of breaks between and you should know what word's going to come up. It begins with T, and I'm going to start drawing T's in second between trials. So our actual process would look like trial, 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 break, break, break. So space, trial, 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 space, 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 trial, 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 and we'd end up with that at the end. Okay, so what we've got here is we've got periods of rest. This here is a break. This is a break. And you might want to start asking yourself what those breaks could be used for. It could have obviously be recovery, but there are other processes taking place here as well. They can be used for guidance, which I don't know if you've studied yet, but you will do. It could be used for feedback. It could be used for coaching. Okay, so all of these things can be done in the breaks. Now, of course, that's really, really valuable, as well as the recovery as well. It can also be used, this is the break, of course, I'm talking about. It can also be used for psychological processes. So think about things like goal setting. Think about things like mental rehearsal. Think about things like centering. These can all be done in those breaks. It's really good, this, for high intensity activities. So obviously a somersault is pretty explosive, right? You can't just keep practicing that over and over again in that massed fashion. So therefore it gives that opportunity for recovery, and it's better for less motivated performers. Now, we've obviously got a very good performer on the screen here. We're not suggesting she's less motivated, but those that need sort of like a break to refocus might be useful for those. Now, negatives. That was an arrow. I can't leave it like that. My arrows are bad at the best of times, not much better. It's less time efficient. Okay, so obviously we do fewer trials per unit of time. We can actually count up and measure the number of trials, right? You get less per unit of time. So the breaks can sometimes equal distraction. So if we've got performers, learners in a flow of practice, we might want to stop that. And the other one is it's not thought to be particularly good for autonomous or highly experienced learners. Okay, they tend to want fewer stops, so they might be some of the weaknesses of this distributor, but it gives us an alternative structure. And of course, you guys would have been experienced with this many times, I'm sure. Now we're going to come down here again. If you've done the guidance lesson, you might be thinking, hey James, that's manual guidance, why we're studying that? Well, it is manual guidance, but what we're interested in here is that we would use a notion of fixed practice. So I want to first of all address what fixed practice is for you. Fixed practice is doing something in a stable, predictable environment. Okay, so and you should already be thinking about closed skills here, of course, basic skills, for example, from our continua, but we've got a stable, predictable environment. What we mean by that is that we have unchanging conditions. So yes, this person is being coached and they're receiving manual guidance, more of which in the guidance lesson if you haven't done that already. But this water is not, it's not a river, it's not flowing, it's not going to hit them with a wave. I guess you could do if someone does a big enough bomb, but you know what I mean. It's a swimming pool controlled condition. They're not racing someone in the same lane. This is simple, basic conditions, and that's a fixed practice environment. So it's really good, positive, green, for our closed skills. Clearly, because closed skills are occurring in a predictable, non-changing environment. That's why. They're unlikely to confuse. Okay, so these practices are usually simple. Swim up and down the lane, swim to the wall, swim to me. These are, well, the person could move themselves, of course, that's a classic, isn't it? But you get the point. It's also really good for basic techniques, or as we said before, it could be really good for overlearning those essential techniques. But there are weaknesses here. It's no good for open and complex skills. So open and complex need something else, which we'll come to in a second. So that's an issue. We get no adaptation, okay? Now, that's two words there, by the way. No adaptation. If we get no adaptation, I'm going to jump forward potentially to another part of the course. Maybe you've studied it, maybe you haven't. This is going to lead to what we call a narrow schema. This is like the memory of movement and how broad that sort of picture or schematic is. And of course, that is going to make a narrow schema. And of course, it gives us narrow experiences of practice. You know, think about how many times you've said to your coach, your teacher, oh, can we play a game now? You want to get out of that kind of fixed environment because you want to get to the more sort of juicy, interesting bit. That's fixed practice. Now, to finish off with, we're going to have a look at effectively what is the opposite of that. We are going to take the idea of variable, sometimes called varied. I'm going to actually put it variable or varied practice. Both terms are absolutely acceptable. And what we're going to say here is now that the environment is changing. So I chose a football throw-in here because you might think, well, the throw-in is quite like a closed technique. Well, no, you're throwing it into an environment which is changing all the time. You might need to loop the ball. You might need to do it fast, slow, long, short. You might need to do it to the right foot, to the left foot. You might need to do it into someone's chest position because they're shielding. That's a changing environment. Therefore, adaptation is required. adaptation required. Okay, and if don't worry if you're not a footballer, you've never done a football throwing before, the principle can be applied to all kinds of things. But that was meant to be green. Basically, folks, if we have got open or complex skills, remember complex are those with lots of decision making, very perceptual, it's essential we do it in a varied way. Perceptual skills, effectively judging what's around you and making an informed decision, is really honed and developed in this kind of environment. We've also got the idea that performers get the experience of decision making. So the performers themselves, of course, they're going to make decisions, and that's going to be more like a near transfer model. They can apply that when they come to, let's say, their game. We've said already about schema. Performing in a varied environment develops schema. Now, of course, that's only relevant if you want to develop broad schema, like an open skill, but that's the whole point. And also, we tend to find, come back to the point I made before about wanting to get to like the game scenario, we tend to find this prevents boredom. You're not just repeating the same thing over and over again. It's changeable. You've got to think. Now, there are negatives, especially early on. It can be overwhelming. So, this is why people might do a drill, then they do the variable practice, right? They might go fixed and then variable second. It's the other thing with variable, it's really not relevant for closed skills. So, think about, practicing the shot put technique with lots of defenders trying to play. It's not realistic, is it? It's not what you're going to do. But the final weakness here is that core skills need learning or need honing first. And that's why I said what I said a moment ago. It may well be that we do sort of closed practice environment stuff, or what we might call fixed practice, and then we introduce the variable as we progress. Those are the types of practice. Hope that's useful. Cheers.